Great you could all be, so many of you could be here at this luncheon this afternoon. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our luncheon speaker, Pinelopi Koujianou Goldberg, who is the current acting chief economist of the World Bank Group while she is on public service leave, while on public service leave from her professorship at Yale. I'll not try to repeat too much of what you can read for yourselves among the biographies you have, but there are some milestones that I'd like to touch on. Professor Goldberg holds a PhD in economics from Stanford, a diplôme in economics from the University of Freiburg, Germany. Over the course of her flourishing career, she has held top positions and served on the boards of several renowned societies, including Vice President of the American Economic Association and Editor-in-Chief of the American Economic Review. She is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Sciences, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a board member of the Bureau of Research and Economic Analysis of Development. Furthermore, she is president-elect of the Econometric Society beginning in 2021. As an applied microeconomist, Goldberg's body of work addresses policy-relevant questions in topics ranging from the determinants and effects of trade policies, trade and inequality, intellectual property rights protection in developing countries, exchange rate pass-through, pricing to market, and international price discrimination. Her most recent research examines the resurgence of protectionism in the U.S. and the interplay between informality and trade liberalization in the presence of labor market frictions. At the World Bank, she has been involved in its efforts to improve the measurement of human capital in developing countries. I look forward to her thoughts today.
Thank you very much, Ned, for this very kind introduction, for the invitation, and most importantly, for pronouncing my middle name so correctly. I think you are the only American who has ever managed to do that. So when Ned invited me to talk today, he asked me to offer, or he was hoping that I would offer a slightly different perspective, namely a perspective that differs from the standard US perspective on the issues of progressivism or socialism. So given my current position at the World Bank, I will try to give you the perspective from the point of view of developing countries. That said, as many other speakers noted, I'm not speaking on behalf of the World Bank, and whatever I say does not necessarily represent the views of the World Bank. However, it has been informed by my experience at the World Bank during the past year. And so let me start with a personal anecdote. I actually just came back from a very long trip that included a stop in France, and I talked to various policymakers there. Many of them would characterize themselves as liberal. And one of them told me at the end, we talked about climate change, we talked about gender, we talked, of course, about inequality. And at the end, this person said to me, you know, the World Bank these days is focused on poverty. But the problem with poverty is it's not relevant to most of us by now. It's relevant only to Africa. So maybe you should move from poverty to something else like inequality, which, by the way, is included in the agenda of the bank, but it's not the main focus. Relatedly, our previous CEO, Kristalina Georgieva, who, as many of you may know, is moving to the IMF now, came back from Davos last year and said something similar. She said, I talked to everyone about climate change, about gender, about inequality. The one word that no one mentions these days anymore is poverty. And I mention that because I want to raise the question of whether our current focus, the current focus of liberals on issues such as inequality and social justice within our own countries, and gender issues and climate change and so on, has not led us to neglect those who are perhaps most in need of our attention. And these are the people who are poor by global standards. And poor, I mean those who live in less than $1.9 per day. And as the French, my first contact pointed out, most of these people are concentrated in Africa, but Africa has 1.4 billion people. And in some countries, the poverty rate is, the extreme poverty rate is above 60%. So it's really an acute problem. So why am I bringing this up in this conference? So I want to link this issue to the last word in the title of the conference, namely nationalism, and also to the issues that we talked about in the very last session. And this resurgence of nationalism, I actually like to think of it more as the backlash against globalization. I believe this is one of the defining trends of the last 5 years. Another way to think about that is the closing of the border. And the reason I think this is an important issue, especially in the context of the World Bank, is because open borders have been fundamental, in my opinion, for one of the greatest achievements of the last 40 or 50 years, which is the fact that we managed to reduce extreme poverty by a lot. So millions of people, mostly in East Asia, managed to lift themselves out of poverty. And of course, I'm not going to claim that this is due only to trade, to open trade, but trade had a lot to do with this. And the fact that there was free, open trade between this part of the world and countries like the United States or Europe helped a lot. There were many other things that went on in these countries, and if you study their history, you'll see that free trade and open markets was not sufficient. But nevertheless, I think we wouldn't do history justice if we didn't concede the fact that trade played a very important role. The integration of these countries into the world trading system played a very important role in lifting them out of poverty. And so right now we are at a point in time where this border, this ideology that fostered open borders seems to be under enormous threat. So I think that in many cases when we analyze the current situation, not only in the United States, but also in Europe, we tend to downplay the role that globalization, pressures coming from globalization, played in the current, in fostering the current environment. And I think there are also a lot of complaints about economists. I don't share, I'm an economist myself, so I don't share the negative view of economists, partly because, again, as was pointed out in the last session, economists are a very heterogeneous set of people, and you will find all kinds of views and all kinds of ideas within economists. But I think it's fair to say that economics tends to be a US-focused field. If it's not US-focused, it tends to be UK-focused. And because of that, because the United States is a very large country, sometimes we tend to doubt, we tend not to pay much attention to the role of trade or globalization as being an important force and an important driver of both economic and political developments. I do think that globalization has a lot to do with the current political and economic environment. And by globalization here, I mean primarily trade, and trade is one of the main issues that is on the policy agenda of the United States these days. That said, I don't think the backlash against globalization is an American phenomenon. If there is something truly global these days, this is this backlash against globalization. We see it in the United States, but we also see it in Europe in the form of the anti-immigration sentiment. We see it even in countries that tend to be equal and have very advanced social safety net systems, like Scandinavian countries. And that leads to the question of what has led to this very strong backlash. The two things come to mind. The first one, and that is very closely related to the topic of the conference, is the rise of inequality. The rise of inequality has been documented in many countries. What is really questionable is whether globalization had something to do with that or not. And until very recently, most economists would have said that despite the claims that trade and globalization were responsible for the rise of inequality, globalization played actually a very small role. I think this is still the case if one focuses on aggregate statistics, on aggregate results. But it is less true if we focus at communities, if we do our analysis not at the aggregate level, not at the national level, but at the local community level. And what recent work has shown is that globalization, trade, had very strong effects on particular communities that were affected by import competition. The same, to a lesser extent, but I think the same applies to immigration. If you look at the aggregate effects of immigration, again, as was pointed out in the last session, the aggregate effects of immigration are not only tiny, they're also beneficial for the economy as a whole. Nevertheless, there are local communities, both in Europe and in the United States, that have been affected by immigration, that have been affected by the large refugee streams. And given how the political systems work, these local communities are sufficient to move, to change political outcomes. So I think what has happened at the local level, at the community level, has a lot to do with the current sentiment in many advanced economies. So what is also interesting, and that's where my interest at the World Bank comes in. What's interesting about this backlash is it takes the form as a backlash not generally against globalization, but specifically as globalization linked to developing countries. And in particular, one, the largest among them, China. China is, no matter what you think about the political system in China, China is a success story from a development point of view. It's the country that has managed to escape poverty, lift millions out of extreme poverty. It's considered a middle-income country now, and in many ways it poses an economic threat both to the United States and many other European countries. So in many cases what we see is not just a backlash against globalization, but the onset of a trade war, and I would say more generally an economic war against China. That has not generalized to other developing countries yet, but there are many developing countries, especially in East Asia, that feel under pressure, that worry about what their future is in such an environment. When we think about the future of development in Africa, one question that we are often faced with is the old path that the World Bank or the IMF recommended for development, namely a path that involved open borders, free trade, does this still make sense for Africa? And I'm not sure that the answer is yes. I'm not sure I would recommend something like that, not necessarily because we have automation, as people say, that because robots are replacing cheap labor, or because there is more competition in international markets, but most importantly, because given the current political environment in advanced countries, given the sentiment in the United States or in Europe, I'm not sure that our countries are receptive to imports produced with cheap labor in Africa. So I'm not sure this path is available to developing countries anymore. And that raises the question of whether in the quest to make our middle class better off, to make our workers better off, to address questions related to inequality, we are closing the door to those who are truly poor, and these are the people in developing countries. The person who has made this trade-off most clear, I think, is actually a liberal, is Branko Milanovic, in a recent book of his on global inequality. And this book is actually, interestingly, his book was based on work he did together with Christopher Luckner while he was at the World Bank. And they pulled data from many countries, and they showed the patterns of global inequality. And what we mean by global inequality is the inequality patterns that emerge if you pool all people all over the world, and then you ask the question, what has happened to their relative standing over the years? And he made a convincing case that what has happened over the course of the last 3 or 4 decades is the poor, the truly poor of the world, have lifted themselves at the expense of the middle class in many advanced countries. So there is a trade-off, if you want, between the prosperity of the poor in developing countries and the middle class in advanced countries. I think this is something that's not emphasized enough these days. And it is partly because it's something that's very, very uncomfortable for a liberal, because it raises the question: how do we value lives? How do we value people who do not live in our own countries? And do we value their lives as much as we value the lives of our own citizens? So I suspect that one response is going to be, it's true perhaps that the middle class has suffered. As I said, until recently, people would dispute the statement I just made, or that Branko Milanovic made, that there is this trade-off, and people would emphasize that globalization had nothing to do with what has happened in advanced countries. I think recent research suggests otherwise. It suggests that globalization has put pressure on the middle class in advanced countries. But many people would suggest, would respond by saying the proper way to address this phenomenon is not by closing the door to developing countries. The proper way to address that is through domestic policies. Taxation is the obvious one. And I agree with that. But to play devil's advocate, the whole problem is that we don't see this view, this closing of the border, being practiced and being advocated only by the right, only by the far right, only by nationalist parties. We also see liberals embrace it. We see the left, both in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, embracing this nationalist agenda that implies the closing of the border. So this is what truly worries me, because ultimately it implies that we are putting our own economies, our own people, ahead of the poor in the rest of the world. Earlier today, we also talked a lot about the rise of market power globally. And many people are calling for rethinking antitrust. I think there are many interesting questions that come up in this context. But in the spirit of the comments I'm making now, I also want to make the case that globalization played a very important role in this rise of market power. And again, this is a phenomenon that we tend to underplay. So why did it play a role? Because in this new era of global value chains, of production fragmentation, where companies can take a product, split it up, take a car, split it up in many processes, in many parts, and they then outsource all the parts and the components to those parts of the world that can produce those cheaply. So in such an era, it's very easy for companies to lower their cost of production. And as they lower their costs, they make higher profits. I think it's as simple as that. So to give you an example that a student of mine gave at Yale, take a company like Zara, the Spanish retail clothing company. The owner of Zara is one of the richest men, I believe, if not the richest in Europe. And in fact, if you look at the profit margins of Zara, they have been increasing over the last 10 or 20 years. Now, retail clothing is a highly competitive sector. There is fierce competition. There is Gap, there is Banana Republic, there is H&M. And the prices are very low for consumers. None of us would claim that we're facing higher prices over time. How can Zara make such huge profits? Well, think about what it costs to produce a piece of clothing. The marginal cost is close to zero. Why? Because this piece of clothing is produced in Bangladesh with extremely cheap labor. Essentially, the cost is the transport cost. But if you take the transport cost out, the production cost is minimized these days. And it's minimized precisely because in this global environment, it's very easy for companies to outsource production to many other parts of the world. And I'm not claiming that this is the full story. That applies to the textile sector. It applies to clothing. It clearly doesn't apply to other sectors. But I do think it's part of the story. Now, if you follow up, if you try to think through of what this implies, so for Zara, this implies high profit margins. For consumers, this implies low prices. So this is good for us. And this is why consumers in general have benefited from globalization, and most consumers are not unhappy today. It implies that people in developing countries in Bangladesh who produce these textiles are actually happy too, are as of now. Maybe they won't be happy in a few years when they try to rise, and then they have to think about how they move up the value chain. That's a different story. But for now, they managed to escape extreme poverty, and that's good news for them. Think of what this implies for workers in the United States or in Europe. That's bad news for them because the production has been offshored to a different country. So there you see the pressure on labor and the declining labor share. So my view is that globalization has played an important role in all these phenomena we documented in recent years. So the rise of market power, the declining labor share. And it does put a lot of pressure on our economic and political system. And by denying its importance, we deny the importance of one of the major sources of dissatisfaction. I want to come to what I originally said. In this environment where the developed countries are becoming more and more hostile towards open borders, and open borders means free trade, but it also means immigration. In this environment, the ultimate losers are going to be the developing countries. To a certain extent, are also going to be the consumers in our own countries. But the United States is a very large country. Europe is rich and large as a continent. The European Union together is pretty large. Even if we don't have free trade, even if we don't have free immigration, they're going to survive. The true losers are going to be the developing countries, and especially those that have not yet managed to connect themselves to the world trading system. And that again brings me to the question that I asked at the beginning, that are we aware of the fact as liberals, as socially minded people, that by embracing sometimes the social agenda in our own countries, we are closing the door to those who are truly poor. And let me finish with two quotes that have resonated to me over time. So one actually comes from the New York Times, from David Brooks, who I think years ago said, it used to be, the big trade-off used to be between big and small government, but going forward, it's not going to be about big versus small government, it's going to be about open versus closed societies. And I very much believe he was right on, that in the future, the trade-off is going to, or the trade-off we are facing today is, do we want our economies to be open to global competition, to all the challenges that this poses for everyone, or do we want to close ourselves off? The reason I think this doesn't have a trivial answer, especially among liberals, is because even John Rawls, famously in his Law of Peoples, stopped short of embracing the goal of global equality. He stopped short of applying his criterion to the globe as a whole. And in fact, if you read passages, if you read the relevant passages from this book, some of the arguments against applying this concept to the world as a whole sound exactly like what conservatives say about the poor people. He emphasizes the importance of the moral hazard problem, how poor nations may decide to work less, spend more money, save less, and live well at the expense of other countries that decide to work hard and save more. And when you read that, to me it sounds very much like the conservative comment sometimes on the poor, how the poor are poor because they deserve to be poor and they're lazy, and that's precisely the reason that they are not worthy of our assistance. So I do think this is an important issue that we need to think about, and I do not have the answer, but I want to put it on the table because I think if you're a policymaker in one of our advanced countries, the answer is pretty clear. You put your country first and you make sure you are accountable to your electorate and you put your electorate first. But if, as academics or public intellectuals, not to mention as being the chief economist of the World Bank, the answer is much less clear to me. And so with this, I will stop and I will be very happy to take questions.
Who would like to ask the first question?
Why not? Thanks. We need to take that into account in calculating the value of open borders and trade.
This is a great question, so thank you. When I say that globalization helped developing countries, the counter-argument is always Mexico. So, and in fact, I confronted this question recently when I visited Vietnam. And Vietnam is a country that has done great by connecting to global value chains. But now they have this enormous anxiety, how do we make it to a high-income country, and how do we avoid being Mexico? That's exactly how they put the question. So I actually, looked at the numbers, and actually the per capita income in Vietnam, it's still lower than the per capita income in Mexico. So my point is that I think where trade helps, where globalization helps developing countries, is in escaping extreme poverty. So all these big companies that arrived in Vietnam, in Bangladesh, in the exports from China, they did provide jobs, initially low-wage jobs that required no skills, same thing in Mexico. So they did allow these countries to go from agriculture to low-skill manufacturing. The problem is some countries, including Mexico, stopped there, right? And then from that point on, globalization did not help. To a certain extent, I think it was the result of choices they made. So for example, in Mexico, there was a deliberate effort to keep wages low in order to be competitive, not to invest in human capital. In China, they've been doing exactly the opposite, precisely because they don't want to be stuck. So globalization is not the answer. It's not the full answer to prosperity. But I do think it helped developing countries make this initial move from being extremely poor to being middle income. That's my...
We're due back at 1:15, so who would like to ask the last question? All right.
There is the resolution of the United Nations from many years ago that the rich countries should give 0.7% of GDP for the purpose of co-financing development and lagging behind countries. The great country of US is giving no more than 0.2%, and President Trump has even cut it down. But my question is, presuming that the rich countries would give 0.7% for ODA, it would make more than $300 billion. Do we have in the contemporary world, at this stage of irreversible globalization, the proper mechanism to distribute extra $300 billion in a sensible way, which will address inclusive, equitable, sustainable development? Do we have the proper mechanism of distribution in the world economy?
I don't know what you mean by the proper mechanism. I mean, there is bilateral aid.
You spend a lot of money in the World Bank. They spend money in the Asian Development Bank, Inter-African Development Bank. We do in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. But you know better than myself that a lot of the money is wasted and misallocated. Yeah. So the question is, do we have, from your perspective, a proper mechanism of optimal allocation of this capital for the purpose of development?
So there is poverty and there is development. So I remember reading, so Angus Deaton wrote The Great Escape, and then he provides this very interesting calculation that if every person in the world gave a tiny amount, I don't remember what it was, but a trivial amount to developing countries, we would eliminate overnight extreme poverty. This would be very easy to do. But this wouldn't be development. It wouldn't be development in the long run. So in order for countries truly to develop, to achieve sustainable development, you need to provide more than money. You need to provide a vision for development, a model for developing. And I think with all its problems, in the past we did have such a model, for many countries. All the theories associated with structural transformation and how you move from agriculture to low-skill manufacturing and perhaps advanced manufacturing and so on. This may still be possible for large countries, but for small developing countries, if you close their borders, then this mechanism disappears, and that's my point, that you're asking for a mechanism. My point is that if you're a small country, in Africa and you close the border, then you deprive them of this mechanism that at least theoretically provided a very sound model for development. Then what's the alternative? We don't have one right now.
Thank you very, very much, Penelope.